Before we dive in, a quick roll call. Tell us what city you're tuning in from. We're curious to know where our listeners are. And now, let's get started. As the net resisted old Julio's pull, heavy and stubborn, he felt a strange, almost forgotten sense of dread. His heart, as if sensing trouble, paused for a moment, skipping a beat, then hammered frantically in his chest. He took such a deep drag on his cigarette that the acrid smoke scraped his lungs, jolting him back to reality. The sun beat down relentlessly, salty sweat stung his eyes, and his hands, accustomed to the sea's trials, suddenly trembled betrayingly. "What the devil has gotten snagged down there?" Julio gasped, swallowing the dry lump in his throat. He thought the net was caught on the bottom, but the boat was in water too deep for rocks or reefs to interfere with his catch. Gathering his remaining strength and muttering curses in every language he knew, Julio tensed his muscles and with one powerful heave hauled the net to the surface. What he saw took his breath away. Amidst the shimmering fish, thrashing and writhing in a desperate bid for life, a large gray dolphin struggled. It was panicking, tangled in the coarse mesh, its large, almost human eyes full of terror and pain, fixed directly on Julio. "Damn it! Where did you come from?" the fisherman murmured softly, feeling a painful clench in his chest. Julio had seen much in his time. The sea was a harsh teacher, and over the long years it had taught him to make tough decisions. But now he froze, feeling a strange, uncharacteristic compassion for this creature. Perhaps it was the dolphin's eyes, large and deep, as if reflecting something very familiar, close, human. His thoughts blurred. Marta, his wife, flashed before his eyes. Pale, wasted by illness, she smiled at him from photographs scattered around their old home. Doctors had recently informed them she urgently needed an expensive operation. Money Julio simply didn't have. The catch was his last hope, and now, looking at the dolphin tangled in the net, he realized that letting it go meant losing the chance to help his wife. "Damn it all!" he muttered again, gazing into those desperate eyes. Julio closed his eyes, trying to find an answer within himself. His conscience, which he had so often ignored in life, was now screaming at him. It told him that his action could change something important, something more significant than mere numbers in a bank account. All right, don't struggle, buddy." The fisherman spoke softly, approaching the net and trying to soothe the dolphin, as if it could understand him. He carefully drew his knife and began to cut the thick ropes, murmuring as if to a child, "Hold on, it'll be easier soon. We both ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time." The net gave way, and finally, feeling its freedom, the dolphin paused for a second, looking intently at Julio, as if trying to memorize his face. There was something grateful and incomprehensible in its gaze. Then it spun sharply and vanished into the depths of the sea, leaving behind only a quiet splash and a deep, strange emptiness. Julio exhaled with relief, wiping his damp forehead, but the joy was fleeting. Looking down, he saw that the net was completely torn, and the precious catch had vanished without a trace into the sea, as if following its unexpected liberator. The fisherman slowly sank onto the boat's bench, understanding that he was left with nothing. Marta's only chance of salvation had been mercilessly lost, dissolving into the waves. "Well, Julio, you made the right choice again," he scoffed bitterly, lighting another cigarette and gazing at the horizon where the sky merged with the sea, promising him an uncertain future full of doubts and the inevitable consequences of his decisions. Returning home, Julio wearily stepped through the doorway, barely keeping himself upright from physical and emotional exhaustion. The small old house greeted him with its usual silence and the scent of medicine mixed with the faint aroma of herbal tea. Marta, his wife, lay on the worn sofa, wrapped in an old blanket. Her face, once radiant and cheerful, was now pale and emaciated, with dark circles under her eyes. Julio quietly approached, sat beside her, and gently took her thin hand in his rough, calloused palms. "I'm sorry, my dear. Nothing worked out today," he said softly, avoiding Marta's gaze. She smiled gently, opening her eyes with effort. "You did all you could. We've always managed, and we will this time too. The main thing is we're together." "Yes, together," Julio replied, feeling the lump in his throat preventing him from speaking. "But that's not enough. You know what the doctor said." Marta sighed softly, turning away for a moment to the window, beyond which the sun slowly dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in crimson hues. "We'll find a way, Julio. Life has never left us without choices, even difficult ones." These words seemed to strike Julio's heart, reviving old painful memories. A scene that had tormented him for years immediately resurfaced, that very evening, when he first made a choice against his own conscience for survival. Then, in desperation and need, he had agreed to help people he later tried to forget, to do something he regretted every sleepless night. That act brought money and temporary relief, but at the same time plunged him into an abyss of internal conflict that he had carefully hidden from Marta all these years. "You know, sometimes I feel like the past will never let us go," Julio mumbled almost inaudibly, staring into space. "It always comes back, making us pay our dues." Marta looked at her husband intently, sensing his inner turmoil. "You're too hard on yourself, Julio. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is who we become after them." He wanted to say something reassuring, but suddenly the phone rang sharply in the quiet room, startling them both. Julio froze, looking warily at the old device. He felt a chilling sense of dread run down his spine. Picking up the receiver, he heard a familiar but long-forgotten voice, a voice that reawakened his old fears and made his heart pound. "Long time no talk, Julio. Time to pay your old debts," the man on the other end of the line said calmly. Julio listened in silence, feeling his world begin to crumble, understanding that the past truly never lets go. Julio awoke before dawn, as if a premonition already awaited him beyond the doorstep. Night still reigned outdoors, but the dark sky above the coast slowly filled with deep blue. He splashed ice-cold water on his face, hoping to shake off the last vestiges of sleep, and glanced at a sleeping Marta. Her breathing was quiet and uneven, and her pallor seemed even more pronounced in the pre-dawn haze. "What am I doing?" Julio whispered to himself, stepping into the yard. A heavy, agonizing weariness enveloped him, a result of the endless chase for money, medicine, and the elusive hope that life would one day be a little easier. Settling into his old battered boat, he slowly pushed off from shore, gazing into the black depths of the sea. Julio loved this moment of solitude. Here, on the border between two elements, he felt simultaneously free and vulnerable. But today, this familiar harmony was disrupted by a heavy, anxious feeling in his chest. He planned to follow his usual route, but as Julio approached the spot where he typically set his nets, he saw something strange. A familiar dark back emerged from the water, gleaming in the faint rays of dawn. A dolphin. The very dolphin he had released a week ago. "Well, here you are again," Julio murmured softly, a mix of smile and surprise on his face. "Decided to be friends with me, buddy?" However, the animal was behaving unusually, thrashing chaotically in front of the boat, emitting sharp, anxious sounds. At one point, the dolphin even nudged the boat's side slightly, as if trying to compel Julio to change course. "What's wrong, pal?" the fisherman asked nervously. His heart suddenly tightened with undefined anxiety. "What do you want from me?" Then the dolphin darted away sharply, only to return, as if beckoning him to follow. Julio pondered, feeling a strange certainty awaken within him that he should trust this mysterious creature. He glanced at his usual route, which promised a good catch, and shook his head. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he said, "All right, have it your way, buddy, since you insist." Resolving, he turned the rudder, steering the boat to follow the dolphin, deviating from his usual path. No more than an hour passed before the weather suddenly changed. Heavy, dark clouds covered the sky, a strong wind rose on the sea, rapidly escalating into a storm. The waves grew increasingly aggressive, and on the horizon, above Julio's old route, lightning flashed, accompanied by deafening thunder. Back on shore, barely having scrambled out of his boat, Julio learned with horror that his friend Alex, who had taken the usual route, had been caught in that very storm. Alex's boat was wrecked, but he himself had miraculously survived, barely rescued by other fishermen from a nearby shore. "So, you saved my life," Julio whispered, looking towards the sea where he had recently seen the dolphin's back. He felt a deep gratitude mixed with an inexplicable fear. What did all this mean? Was it just a coincidence, or was fate trying to tell him something? He walked slowly home along the wet sand, feeling overwhelmed by a flood of questions for which he had no answers. Why had this dolphin chosen him? Was this rescue simply a repayment for the kind deed he had done a week ago? Or was the sea trying to tell him something more, to remind him that he was still indebted to life? Suddenly, he stopped, noticing a stranger's silhouette in the distance, slowly approaching him. The man was clearly waiting for him. "You're Julio, aren't you?" The stranger's voice was cold and calm, with a barely perceptible sarcasm. "My name is Sebastian. You don't know me, but I remember you perfectly. I witnessed that act you'd rather forget." Julio's mouth went dry. A sudden chill enveloped his body, as if someone had poured a bucket of icy water over him. "What do you want from me?" Julio's voice was quiet and strained. Sebastian smiled almost amicably and looked the fisherman directly in the eyes. "It's time to pay old debts, Julio, and believe me, this debt will cost you much more than you can imagine." These words hung in the air like a heavy, ominous threat, making Julio's heart pound wildly. Everything inside him tightened with fear and a bad premonition. Fate clearly had another trial in store for him, a trial he might not endure. Julio did not move, feeling his feet literally rooted to the damp sand. The stranger's words still echoed in his head. It's time to pay old debts. He tried to understand how Sebastian could know something Julio had tried to hide even from himself. Sebastian stood opposite him, perfectly calm and confident, with a barely perceptible sarcastic smile that made Julio feel like a helpless child before an adult. "I don't know you," Julio finally managed, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "And I don't understand what debt you're talking about." Sebastian took a step closer, scrutinizing the fisherman as if he were a rare fish caught in his net. "But I know you perfectly, Julio," he said in an icy tone. "Human memory is short, especially when it comes to shame and conscience. But don't worry, I'll remind you." "What do you want?" Julio interrupted him nervously. He felt anger, fear, and helplessness intertwined within him, creating an unbearable mix of emotions. Sebastian paused, looking out at the sea as if contemplating something distant and unrelated to the conversation. "I know about your wife, Marta, if I'm not mistaken." He glanced at Julio, carefully observing his reaction. Julio felt the blood drain from his face, and a chill of alarm ran down his spine. "She's sick, right? And it seems you're quite desperate." "Don't you dare touch my wife," Julio hissed, clenching his fists. "Calm down, my friend," Sebastian replied calmly. "I'm not threatening. I'm offering help, money for her treatment, as much as needed to save Marta." Julio fell silent, stunned and frightened at the same time. He intuitively felt that this help would come with a price he wasn't willing to pay, but the mere possibility of helping Marta was stronger than his fear. "You won't do it just like that," he said cautiously, trying to hide the hope in his voice. "Of course not," Sebastian smirked. "But what I'm proposing isn't that difficult. There's the Mendoza family in town, influential scoundrels, as you probably know. A few years ago, they ruined many lives, including mine. I want you to help me, let's just say, level the playing field." Julio felt something break inside him. The Mendoza name was familiar, a rich and powerful family no one dared to cross. They controlled almost everything in town, and Julio knew firsthand the rumors of their cruel methods. "I'm not a murderer," the fisherman said coldly. "I'm not asking you to kill." Sebastian chuckled. "What I need from you is quite different. You just need to incapacitate their boat, discreetly, at night. A couple of simple moves, and the Mendozas will temporarily lose something they value so much. Believe me, they deserve it." Julio felt pain squeeze his chest from the rush of doubts. Yes, he hated the Mendozas, like many in this town, but becoming part of someone else's revenge felt wrong. "What if I refuse?" he asked dully. "Then I'll leave," Sebastian shrugged. "And you'll continue to watch your wife fade away and your conscience die with her. And believe me, my friend, conscience will die faster than you think." Julio looked at the waves, endlessly and methodically crashing against the shore, as if seeking advice or a hint from them, but the sea remained silent, leaving him alone with his painful choice. "Must I sacrifice my conscience for life again?" he agonized, feeling fear and guilt drag him deeper into the darkness of doubt. Sebastian, as if reading Julio's thoughts, added quietly, "I saw you back then, many years ago, Julio. You've done this before, haven't you? You've crossed that line before. It's like riding a bike. Once you try it, you never forget how." Julio sighed heavily, feeling like a cornered animal. He knew he had practically no choice, but something inside wouldn't let him fully agree. "I'll do it," he finally said hoarsely, feeling each word come with difficulty. "But I have one condition." Sebastian raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "No one gets hurt, understand?" Julio said firmly, looking Sebastian directly in the eyes. "If so much as a hair falls from their head, I'd rather die in poverty, but I'll drag you down with me." Sebastian smiled again, but this time his smile was sincere, almost respectful. "Excellent, Julio. I knew I could count on you. But be prepared, your conscience just took another step towards the abyss." Julio remained silent, feeling the poison of doubt and anxiety begin to eat away at his soul. He knew there was no turning back now. Julio moved through the narrow streets of the port district, wrapped in his dark old jacket to avoid drawing attention. His heart pounded fiercely as if trying to escape his chest. In his hands he clutched a small tool bag that Sebastian had given him. "Just disable the boat. A couple of simple moves," he repeated to himself, but every cell in his body resisted it. He approached the dock where the Mendoza family's yacht was moored, luxurious and ostentatious in its grandeur. The lights reflected off the sleek, white surface, and a security guard ambled nearby, lazily smoking a cigarette and gazing into the distance. Julio paused for a moment in the shadows, contemplating. His conscience battled his desperation. Sebastian's words echoed in his head. "Conscience will die faster than you think." He sighed heavily, remembering Marta lying in bed with painful pallor and hope in her eyes. "What are you doing, you old fool?" he whispered to himself, clenching his fingers into a fist. "What are you doing with your life?" Julio recalled that distant moment when he first crossed the line of what was permissible. Then he had justified himself with circumstances, the need to survive, to help his family. Now it was different. Now he knew that this step could be the beginning of the end, that he was once again crossing a boundary beyond which his conscience might never recover. He cautiously approached the boat, quickly slipping past the guard who had turned away to flick his cigarette into the water. His heart stopped, his breath hitched. Once on deck, Julio pulled the tools from his bag, preparing to fulfill Sebastian's request. Suddenly, he froze. A strange thought occurred to him. What if the dolphin that had saved him from the storm was a sign, a message from above? Maybe the sea was trying to stop him, to warn him of something important. But he hadn't heard it then, and now he was here, on the verge of a terrible act. Julio felt lost and pathetic in the face of fate. He looked back at the dark waves, slowly rolling to shore, as if trying to read in them the answer to his tormenting question, "Is this truly the price of saving loved ones?" "How did you come to this, Julio?" he murmured aloud, shaking his head. "Is this truly your life?" He closed his eyes, feeling the bitterness of regret and shame mixed with a heavy pain. Before him stood Marta, her gentle smile, her soft gaze, and then the Mendozas and their cruelty, their endless arrogance, and Sebastian with his sarcastic smirk. He stood between two worlds, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, as if sobered by a cold wind, he sensed someone approaching. The guard was returning to the boat, whistling a cheerful tune. Julio's heart skipped a beat. He quickly hunched down, hiding behind the railing, and felt cold sweat trickle down his back. This is it, the moment of truth, Julio thought. There's no turning back now. He clutched his tools, ready to act, but suddenly felt his gaze drawn back to the sea. Julio froze abruptly. On the horizon, in the distance, he discerned a barely perceptible silhouette, the familiar back of a dolphin, shimmering almost ethereally in the moon's reflection. His heart fluttered, his breath caught. "You again?" he whispered, stunned, forgetting everything around him. "You came for me even here?" It was as if an invisible thread inside him snapped. This sign, appearing at the most critical moment, drastically altered his intentions. Julio felt his fear and doubts dissolve, replaced by a sudden clarity. He quickly put his tools back into the bag and stepped away, deciding not to commit the act that would lead to his final downfall. "No, Sebastian, I will not do this with my own hands," Julio whispered resolutely, feeling a sudden lightness, as if a huge burden had fallen from his shoulders. Having gotten off the boat, he once again looked at the horizon. The Dolphin was no longer visible, as if it had simply dissolved into the night. But Julio no longer felt alone. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he had done the right thing, following the voice of his conscience. However, the feeling of lightness vanished as quickly as it appeared. One thought resonated clearly in his mind. Sebastian would not let this go, and Julio knew that his problems had only just begun. Returning home late that night, Julio stood at the door for a long time, hesitant to enter. Each heartbeat echoed in his head like hammer blows. Shame and relief mingled, leaving a strange, agonizing feeling of unspoken emotion within him. Finally, he stepped inside, and the door closed behind him, as if putting an end to his torment. Marta sat on the bed, leaning against the pillow and coughing softly. The sight of her drawn face and sad eyes painfully squeezed Julio's heart. He sat beside her, gently took her thin, illness-weakened hand in his palms, and silently pressed it to his lips. "Why are you so sad?" she asked softly, smiling weakly, as if sensing his pain and anxiety. "I know you, Julio. Tell me what happened." Julio sighed heavily and wearily, as if, with that sigh, he released all his fears and doubts. "I'm confused, Marta," he began quietly, avoiding her gaze. "I feel like my whole life is a series of mistakes and wrong decisions which have now all caught up to me at once." She gently touched his shoulder, letting him know she was ready to listen. And then, for the first time, Julio decided to tell his wife everything, about Sebastian and his offer, about the agonizing moral choice, about how he had almost agreed to a crime in an attempt to save her health. The words came with difficulty, but the more he spoke, the lighter his heart became, as if he was freeing himself from a heavy burden that had long been buried deep inside. "Once, many years ago," Julio continued, head bowed, "I did something I'm still ashamed to remember. I stole Marta, not for myself, but for our family, so we wouldn't starve. Sebastian knows about it, and now I'm on the brink again. Do you understand? He wants me to commit another evil act, seemingly small, insignificant, but still evil. I almost agreed, Marta. Almost." He fell silent, breathing heavily, not daring to look her in the eyes. Silence hung in the room, and only the sound of her breathing broke the oppressive atmosphere. "You did the right thing," Marta finally said softly. Her voice was weak, but firm. "You mustn't go against your nature. I've known you for so many years, and I know your soul isn't meant for such acts. You can't fool your conscience, Julio. You did right by listening to your heart." "But if I don't agree, you—" Julio trailed off, unable to voice the terrible thought. Marta smiled sadly and gently stroked his cheek, comforting him like a child. "I've long come to terms with my fate, my love. You can't take responsibility for everything that happens in this world. Sometimes the best choice is to accept what you cannot change and save what you still can, yourself." Julio felt her words slowly penetrate deep within him, touching chords in his soul he had avoided for years. She was right, and he knew it. Signs, warnings, had already appeared in his life. The Dolphin, unexpectedly emerging on his path, his escape from the storm. None of it was coincidence. He felt it in every fiber of his being. "Why is all this happening to me?" Julio asked softly, looking at the ceiling as if expecting an answer from above. Because you are a living person, Julio, Marta smiled. We all make mistakes, we all get lost in life, but it's the ability to choose that makes us human. You chose wisely. I believe in you. Her eyes glistened with tears, but they were tears of pride and love. Julio felt a sudden surge of strength, as if her words had restored his long-lost faith in himself. At that very moment, a loud, sharp knock on the door startled them both. Julio slowly stood up, his heart once again pounding rapidly and anxiously. Opening the door, he saw Sebastian. His eyes were cold and irritated, and his former sarcastic smile had vanished without a trace. "You failed me, Julio," Sebastian said in a quiet, icy voice. "I am a patient man, but there's a limit to everything. My patience is wearing thin, and you're running out of time. You know perfectly well what you're risking." "I told you I won't harm anyone," Julio replied firmly, trying to hide the fear that gripped him anew. "That's a shame," Sebastian rasped, a sneer on his face, his gaze unwavering. "But if that's what you want, your fate is now in the hands of chance. And believe me, chance is unlikely to be as merciful to you as I am." With those words, Sebastian turned and vanished into the night, leaving Julio standing in the doorway, consumed by an anxious premonition. He knew these weren't empty threats. Something inevitable awaited him, something that would force him to choose again between conscience and survival. Only this time, the stakes would be much higher. The sea was restless today, as if reflecting Julio's inner turmoil. Heavy clouds hung low, almost touching the churning waves. He walked slowly towards his boat, feeling his insides clench with tension and fear. He knew that today's encounter with Sebastian would decide everything, either finally free him from the nightmares of the past or utterly destroy him. Pushing off from shore, Julio gazed towards the horizon. The sea was rapidly darkening, and the waves grew more aggressive with each passing moment, but he had no other choice. Today, he had to face his own destiny. He thought of Marta's words, which had deeply touched his heart. "You can't fool your conscience, Julio." He felt he should have listened to her earlier, when his life could still have taken a different path. But now it was too late, and his path led directly into the raging storm. Within an hour, he spotted the silhouette of Sebastian's boat rocking on the waves. As they approached each other, the sky had already turned almost black, and the wind howled with such force that Julio struggled to stay on his feet. "You came after all!" Sebastian yelled over the roar of the wind, a sarcastic smirk on his face. "So, fate gave you one last chance to correct your mistakes?" Julio didn't answer, looking at Sebastian with barely concealed hatred and regret intertwining. Suddenly, a massive wave crashed against their boats, forcing both men to struggle to maintain their footing. The storm gathered strength, and the sea began to decide their fate itself. "Enough!" Julio screamed, trying to be heard over the furious gusts of wind. "Leave me and my family alone!" "Too late, Julio." Sebastian laughed, clinging to the side as another wave nearly capsized his boat. "We've both gone too far. No one's getting out of this dry." Suddenly, there was a dreadful splintering sound. Sebastian's boat listed sharply, and he tumbled overboard, instantly vanishing into the churning waves. Julio instinctively rushed to the edge, trying to spot anything in the frothing water. His heart pounded wildly. Images of his past, his mistakes and regrets, flashed before his eyes, and he suddenly realized He couldn't live with himself if he let Sebastian die, even if it meant risking his own life for a man who had tried to ruin him. "Damn it!" he cried out, casting aside his last doubts, and plunged into the raging sea. The cold waves crashed over him, instantly paralyzing his body. He desperately scanned for Sebastian until he spotted him nearby, barely treading water. "Hold on!" Julio yelled, struggling to reach him through the waves. "Grab onto me!" Sebastian, weakened and stunned, barely managed to grasp Julio's outstretched hand. At that very moment, a powerful wave separated them from the boat, sweeping them further out to sea. Both men thrashed in the water, trying to stay afloat, but their strength quickly waned. Julio felt his body failing him, his breath seizing. The water repeatedly closed over his head, and he knew his chances of survival were becoming negligible. "Why did you do that?" Sebastian croaked, barely keeping afloat, looking at Julio with stunned disbelief. "Because I'm not like you, Sebastian." Julio gasped, struggling to speak. "I can't live knowing I left someone to die, even someone like you." Suddenly, a massive wave engulfed them both again. In his last moment, Julio pushed Sebastian closer to the wreckage of the boat, giving him a chance to cling on while he himself was dragged under the water. He no longer resisted. His body, drained of strength, slowly descended into the cold darkness, which grew calmer and quieter with each passing second. He knew this was the end, but there was a surprising clarity in his soul. For the first time in a long time, he had acted as he believed was right, and his conscience no longer tormented him. But at that moment, as consciousness almost left him, through the murky haze, Julio noticed a familiar silhouette rapidly approaching from the depths. The Dolphin moved directly towards him, as if sent by the sea itself. "You're here again," he managed to think before the world around him plunged into impenetrable darkness. Julio awoke on the shore, gasping and spitting out salty water. Sharp pain shot through his body, and his head spun so violently it felt as though he had just surfaced from the deepest depths of his past. Through half-closed eyelids he discerned the gray morning sky and heard the sound of the sea, gently caressing the sandy beach. With effort, he pushed himself up on his elbows and looked around. No one. Only the waves whispered something soothing, as if comforting him after the nightmare. But the question that arose in his mind stirred him again. Who had saved him? Was it the Dolphin, that strange messenger of fate, or Sebastian, the man whose life had recently been in his hands? Julio slowly rose to his feet and surveyed the shore. He was completely alone. There were no traces of Sebastian, nor any signs of rescue. Only scattered debris from the boat on the sand served as a reminder of the storm from which he had miraculously escaped. Returning home, Julio found Marta, waiting for him anxiously. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled, clutching the phone to her chest. "Julio, you're alive! Thank God you're alive!" she cried, throwing herself into his arms. He held her tightly, feeling his heart fill with warmth and relief. "How did you escape? What happened out at sea?" Marta bombarded him with questions, simultaneously crying and smiling. "I don't know," he answered honestly, carefully sitting beside her. "I saw the Dolphin, but maybe it was Sebastian." She looked at him in surprise. "Sebastian? Are you sure?" Julio shook his head. "No, not at all. His boat was in splinters. I lost sight of him. But someone pulled me out." Marta nodded, gazing thoughtfully into the distance. "Perhaps it was meant to be. Perhaps you've been given a second chance." she said softly. Julio pondered Marta's words again. A second chance. But did he deserve it? Or was it just a postponement of the inevitable reckoning for old mistakes? He tried to convince himself that he had done enough to atone for his past, but doubts lingered. However, the next few days brought unexpected changes. Financial difficulties suddenly began to resolve themselves. A distant relative, whom Julio hadn't seen in years, unexpectedly called and offered help with Marta's treatment. Then a man from the town council appeared at their doorstep, informing them that the family was due compensation for a long-forgotten loss of fishing gear. It seemed as if fate itself had decided to rectify what seemed irreparable. But Julio felt that something more profound lay beneath these sudden gifts of fortune. Could it be some strange compensation for the suffering and difficult choices he had made trying to save his family? Maybe everything will be all right now, Marta asked hopefully, looking at her husband, but there was uncertainty in her voice, as if she too sensed a hidden catch. I hope so, Julio replied, but an uneasy feeling persisted within him, as if this were just a temporary calm before a new storm. A few days later, in the morning, someone knocked on the door. Standing on the doorstep was a neighbor, an elderly man named Carlos, who often walked the beach looking for whatever the sea had washed ashore. "Good morning, Julio," he said congenially, but his face was serious and troubled. "I found something strange on the beach. Thought it might mean something to you." He extended his hand, and a familiar locket gleamed in his palm. Sebastian's family locket. Julio felt a chill run down his spine, his heart painfully contracting. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly, carefully taking the locket. "Where you washed ashore." It was lying on the sand, as if someone had deliberately left it there, Carlos answered thoughtfully. "I immediately thought of you. Is something wrong?" "Everything's fine," Julio mumbled, trying to conceal his agitation. "Thanks, Carlos. You've been a great help." Closing the door, he silently stared at the locket in his hand. At that moment, he fully understood that his story was far from over. Sebastian hadn't just disappeared. He had left this mysterious item behind, a reminder that fate had not yet finished its reckoning. Julio closed his eyes, clutching the locket so tightly that the metal dug into his skin. He had to find out if the sea had truly washed away his past, or if this was just the beginning of a new chapter, which might prove far more dangerous than the last. Julio stood on the shore, tightly clutching Sebastian's locket, as if trying to hear the voice of the man who had vanished as suddenly as he appeared. The sun slowly set below the horizon, painting the sea in crimson hues, and he felt that it was here, by the water, where his story began and would end. He took a step closer to the waves and suddenly noticed a familiar silhouette. His heart clenched in surprise. The Dolphin was there again, gazing at him motionlessly as if awaiting his return. Their eyes met, and Julio felt a strange connection to this creature, which recently seemed to have led him along, showing him the path to something important. "Why are you still here?" he asked softly, addressing the animal, but in reality, talking to himself. "What are you trying to tell me? Why did you choose me?" The Dolphin slowly swam closer, and Julio felt as if he could read understanding in its gaze, deep, sincere, and silent. At that moment, it dawned on him. This Dolphin had never been just an animal. It was his inner voice, his conscience, the very choice he had tried to suppress for so long by compromising with himself. Julio sat directly on the sand, his eyes fixed on the sea. He plunged into his thoughts, recalling everything he had been through in recent weeks, months, and even years. His life seemed like a chain of decisions, each with its own price. He remembered the stolen money with which he once fed his family, and that conscience that gradually thinned as he tried to convince himself that the end justified the means. But now he knew the truth. There was no goal worth losing himself for. He realized this when he leapt into the storm to save Sebastian. Then he made a choice with his heart, not pondering benefits or consequences. And it was at that moment that he felt free, even if it almost cost him his life. Mistakes, Julio thought, looking at the Dolphin bobbing on the waves. They always come back until we learn the lesson they carry. Perhaps this whole story was necessary for me to finally learn to live in peace with myself. He smiled to himself, feeling an inner calm for the first time in a long while. But one question continued to torment him. What had happened to Sebastian? Why had he disappeared, leaving only the locket, as if hinting at the unspoken nature of their last encounter? Julio stood up, deciding he couldn't move forward until he understood what had truly happened. He looked up and noticed the Dolphin swimming away, slowly dissolving into the deepening twilight. Julio watched it go, understanding that it wasn't leaving forever, but only until he once again needed a reminder of the right choice. Taking a deep breath of the salty air, he headed towards the place where he first met Sebastian, the dock from which this whole tangled story began. As he approached, he suddenly noticed a small envelope on an old wooden post, as if intentionally left for him. His heart quickened as he cautiously took the letter. There was no address on the envelope, only a short phrase in Sebastian's familiar handwriting: "To him who dared to make the right choice." Julio froze, feeling anxiety mixed with hope and fear all at once. What did Sebastian want to tell him? Why did he choose to leave, leaving this strange message as if trying to convey something important? He slowly opened the envelope and saw a few lines written in the same confident hand. "Julio, if you are reading this letter, it means you again stand on the threshold of a choice. I, too, once found myself at such a crossroads. But unlike you, I chose incorrectly. Now I am paying a price that no money can redeem. Thank you for giving me a chance to see what my path could have been had I chosen differently. Guard your conscience, for it is the only thing that truly matters at the end of the journey." Julio stood motionless, feeling his eyes fill with tears of relief and bitter wisdom. In these words he found answers to many questions, but even more remained unspoken. The letter didn't explain everything, but it clearly stated that the choice always remained his, and it was this choice that would determine the price of his future. He looked up at the horizon, feeling truly alive and ready to face any trial that still lay ahead. But a deep sense of incompleteness lingered. Sebastian had clearly left room in his story for something more, something Julio still had to understand. Julio slowly folded the letter and stood still for a long time, listening to the waves softly whisper their secrets, secrets he would never fully know. Sebastian's words echoed in his mind like a distant memory, reminding him that fate never brings a full stop. It only changes the form of the questions that everyone must find their own answers to. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool wind on his face, and looked at the sea again. It was calm, almost serene, as if all the storms and upheavals he had endured had never happened. But now Julio knew that the silence was deceptive. Beneath its smooth surface, mysteries always lurked, capable of overturning life with their mere appearance. So that's how it is, Sebastian, he thought, clutching the letter in his hands. You left me not answers, but questions. But perhaps that's even better. In his mind, the image of the dolphin, that mysterious creature that had accompanied him throughout the story, suddenly resurfaced. He wondered why fate had chosen him, a simple fisherman from the shores of a small coastal town. Perhaps everyone has their own dolphin, their inner voice, which we either follow or try to escape all our lives.